guys, and welcome back to English with Dry. Today we are taking a look at Act 1 of An Inspector Calls. I'm going to be talking you through the first part of the scene. If we take a look at the cast list, first of all, the protagonists who we'll be dealing with today are Arthur Burling, Sybil Burling, Sheila Burling, Eric Burling, and Gerald Croft. What is interesting to note about how this character list has been written is the way in which they are largely described in terms of their relationship to Arthur Burling. We can see here very clearly that Sybil is called his wife, Sheila is called his daughter, and Eric is called his son. Now, what this seems to do is reinforce the patriarchal society that existed in Edwardian England. It confirms that he is very much in charge of what is going on in the household, and he is very much the final word in the building. Of course, you will notice that Sybil is spelt incorrectly there. That is due to the low-quality PDF I had to use to make this video. Okay, so moving on, we initially see the stage directions for how the set is supposed to look. The part that's most noteworthy is that the household is described as not cosy and homelike. Now, this indicates that despite being extremely affluent, the Burling family may not actually get along with each other very well. The family relationship, perhaps, is not one that is particularly strong, and therefore this contributes to the idea that despite having all the trimmings and trappings of wealth, this household is not actually a very happy place. The rest of the description is largely to do with where things are placed, chairs, for instance, etc., etc. Now, these things are all important. However, they are not necessarily the most relevant. However, something that is important is the description of the lighting as being pink and intimate until the inspector arrives, at which point it becomes brighter and harder. Now, this is obviously a complete contrast, and this simply shows that the inspector's purpose in the play is to shine a spotlight on the Burlings and Gerald Croft and illuminate the things they have actually done so that they can't sit in comfortable ignorance any longer. A bit like how a suspect would be interrogated in a police cell. And so, we'll begin our reading of the play. It is, of course, Arthur who is talking at first, asking the parlour-maid Edna for port so that he may make a toast. It is a dinner party, the purpose of which is to celebrate the engagement of Gerald to Sheila. Now, Arthur is described as being as being provincial in his speech. Now, what this means is that it suggests he is not from money. Now, by this I mean that he was not born into the upper classes in the same way that his wife was. It suggests that he is a self-made man, which means that perhaps he managed to earn enough money and was successful enough in business to make his way to where he is today. A more humble background might be a good way of describing it. His wife, however, is called his social superior. Now, what this means is that she actually has been born into money. She is part of the, either the aristocracy or the landed gentry. Either way, essentially, she, we can expect, will know more about the, should we say, the accepted etiquette of what people on this tier of the social hierarchy were supposed to adhere to. She would be more comfortable and aware of the things that people like her and her husband should be doing. She is also called a cold woman, which straight away presents her as somebody who is not a matriarch, should we say, not motherly. Now, that's a stereotypical view of motherhood. However, it certainly fits in with the idea of it not being particularly homelike. The next part that is interesting to note is Eric's description. He is called half shy and half assertive. Now, this means that he perhaps is not fully formed as a person. We hear that he's in his early 20s. And it also shows that he doesn't really know where he is supposed to be, in the sense of he doesn't know how he fits into the world yet. He's not comfortable in his own skin. And this is something that is certainly borne out later on in the play. What is interesting to note is that Arthur is immediately trying to impress Gerald. He has clearly bought this port, which is a type of alcohol, to impress him. He sort of beggingly says, "It's the port that your father gets from him," meaning the shopkeeper. Now, this is something that obviously he has researched, and clearly it's important to him to impress Gerald, who is totally nonplussed by the whole thing. Sheila then, the stage direction says gaily and possessively. Now, this desire to possess Gerald, who is her fiance, is quite childish in its kind of insistence. Her wish to be in charge of him is something quite bizarre. And it shows perhaps also her insecurity. It implies maybe that she does not feel like that he is truly hers yet. Now, this is a thread that will be picked up later on as we find out more about what Gerald has done. However, it hints perhaps at the fact she may know something and doesn't feel quite at ease. Now, as this scene goes on, Arthur describes how the meal was first class, and he instructs Sybil, his wife, to thank the cook. Now, she immediately tells him off, saying, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." Now, this kind of is their relationship in a nutshell. It encapsulates their class difference. For him, being wealthy enough to be able to afford a cook or a chef is something to brag about. To him, it's confirmation that he has made it in life. The fact that he is so wealthy that he can pay somebody else to make his dinner for him is the kind of the true sign that he's made it. Now, that shows that once upon a time he did not have people to do this for him. It's him ostentatiously trying to show that he is a man of means. Now, Sybil, on the other hand, has grown up in this life. She has grown up in houses where people wait on her hand and foot, where people bring her dinner, where people bring her whatever it is she wants. And that is why she is almost embarrassed by him drawing attention to it. For people like Sybil, the servants and the serving classes in general were not supposed to even be acknowledged. They were supposed to be tools in the same way that a knife or a fork would be. And therefore, this idea that this is a sort of luxury to be shown off for her makes her deeply uncomfortable. And of course, it also reinforces the idea that Mrs. Burling isn't a particularly pleasant woman who is, very quick to be critical of her husband and what he does. Now, we start to hear more about the relationship between Sheila and Gerald, and we hear about how the previous year, where presumably they had been together and courting, he wouldn't come anywhere near her. Now, she says this, and the stage direction says half seriously, half playfully. Now, this is, of course, reminiscent of the stage direction of Eric, and it implies the same thing about her. She is not truly comfortable in her own skin yet. But it also shows that there is more going on than meets the eye. It suggests that actually she probably does have an idea of why Gerald didn't come near her, and doesn't necessarily believe his excuse that he was busy at work. However, it suggests that she is willfully ignoring this. Throughout the play, the idea of willful ignorance or deliberately refusing to accept the truth is something that is very important, and it's used to characterize the Burling family. And it's something that she may be doing here. Possibly she has been taught as well to suppress serious thoughts as a woman. We appreciate at the beginning of the play that Sheila has been brought up in a very sheltered way because of her gender. And this is something, of course, that she gets past as the play goes on. But the fact is, she says, "I wonder what happened to you." And there is a hint that she does know. She knows why he wasn't there. Now, obviously, later on we discover that this is because he was having an affair with Eva Smith. But Sheila is anything but stupid, and so it's highly likely that she would have known this. But again, she is, as I said, being willfully ignorant. Now, as we go on, we see that her mother almost tells her off for this. She reminds her that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. Now, this implies that Sybil Burling has led a similar life to the one she anticipates that Sheila is about to, and also that she has accepted this gender discrepancy, this inconsistency in terms of gender. She has become, inured to this idea, which means she's become used to this idea that the gender role expected of a good wife is to not ask questions, to not be overly critical, and to understand, or that perhaps all of the things their husbands do are not to be questioned, or rather, it's best not to know about them. And this is just how the gender dynamic was in Edwardian England. At this point, Eric starts to pipe up, and Sheila accuses him of being squiffy. Now, this term means drunk, and it's worth remembering from later on in the play because alcohol is a huge theme in it, and particularly the abuse of alcohol is something that is revisited later in a different way. But back in the scene, we hear that it's a delightful little family party, a celebration. And Arthur Burling starts to discuss Gerald's parents, Sir George and Lady Croft. Now, of course, we find out that these people are Arthur Burling's, or rather, Sir George Croft is Arthur Burling's rival in business. And because of this, it almost seems like their union is like a business arrangement. He says we may look forward to a time when Crofts and Burlings are no longer competing, but working together for lower costs and higher prices. Now, this makes it seem like the marriage of his daughter to Gerald Croft is something of a business transaction, the sort of thing you might have seen hundreds of years ago when wealthy families married their two children together in order to create a power that existed between them. Now, this really reinforces how old-fashioned the Arthur Burling's views of the world are. The idea that marriage should be a union of loving equals is totally alien to him. And then Gerald, as he often does, completely mindlessly agrees. It's clear to them that the making of money and the success in business is far more important to them than any kind of personal happiness, which may explain why Gerald does exactly what we later find out that he does. At this point, Gerald reveals the wedding ring that he has purchased for his wife-to-be, Sheila. He brings out the ring case, and she says, "Is it the one you wanted me to have?" Now, this kind of points to who is entirely in charge of this relationship. Remember, Gerald is a slightly older man. And so, naturally there is the advantage that being older has. However, there is more than that. He is entirely in control of this relationship. He is choosing what his wife will wear to signify their union. And moreover, he's not just choosing it, he has, told her what she is to do, and she has accepted it. And so in that sense, she is following all of this sort of advice that her mother would have given her over the years. Oh, it's wonderful. Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? Now, the use of mummy and daddy, of course, implies her childishness. But then when she says, now I really feel engaged, this points to her superficiality. It's symbolic of the fact that she doesn't really understand what marriage means, and she thinks it is more of a token gesture, or rather, she has this childish opinion that it is this wonderful, beautiful pageant of a thing. She doesn't understand the reality of it at all, in that she believes it can be summarized or best shown by a simple ring. So again, Sheila is presented as spoilt and childish and unaware of how the world really works. At this point, Mrs. Burling suggests that she and Sheila leave them, and before they take coffee in the drawing room or wherever it might be. Now, this just shows us the gender dynamic, that essentially there comes a point in the night at a dinner party where the women would leave the men in upper class households so that the men could discuss quote unquote serious things such as, say, business or politics, which is exactly how Burling tries to progress the evening along. But again, it shows that Sybil is complicit in this worldview. She does not make any attempt to subvert it. She does not make any attempt to go against her husband. She is entirely happy with the status quo, which is an important aspect of Sybil's character throughout this play. Now, this is where Arthur Burling starts to lecture them. And he calls himself a hard-headed businessman. Now, of course, by this he means practical and successful and will not be made a fool of and will always get the best deal possible. However, there's a clear wordplay going on in that it also suggests that perhaps he's a bit stupid. Now, obviously, you shouldn't say ever in your essays that he is stupid. The word ignorant is the best way to describe him. He is ignorant. Now, ignorant, of course, again, means deliberately refusing to educate yourself. There is an active choice in the word ignorant, and of course that's what Burling does. And at this point, Priestley begins to use dramatic irony pretty heavily. As you should be aware, the play was written in 1945 and set in 1912. And therefore, a lot of the things that the characters say and do, or talk about happening in the future, or rather the immediate future, would be things that the audience in 1945 and onwards would have known to be either true or false. So when he talks about how peace is on the horizon and increasing prosperity for everyone, and the fact that war is completely impossible, it would be clearly utterly hilarious to the audience of 1945, because 2 years after this was set, there was the Great War, as it was called, World War I, one of the most bloody and extended and conflict the world has ever seen, with one of the highest death tolls. And so really, it's not just that he's wrong, it's that he couldn't be more wrong. Now, the idea as well that he talks about possible labour troubles being gotten rid of is also quite ignorant, because many political historians argue that the only thing that actually stopped a social revolution in England was World War I. France had its social revolution in 1789, and Russia had the first of its in 1905, and then also in 1914, and then again in 1917. So the idea that the workers were suddenly happy with what was going on in the world is completely incorrect, of course. But all of this just speaks to how we cannot trust Burling and his worldview. And of course, because Burling represents capitalism so clearly, we can, by extension, say, well, Priestley is criticising not just Arthur Burling, but all capitalists like him. Eric interjects, what about war? And this is interesting because it suggests that perhaps actually he's a bit better informed than we might give him credit for being. We would often think of Eric as a kind of foolish young man, which is exactly what he is, but he's not totally ignorant, because he is aware that a war is impending. Now, obviously, his father puts him down straight away. The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war. Again, this is utter nonsense, because as I've mentioned clearly, the war that comes is as vast as it is cruel. The largest conflict of its kind that had ever been in the world, largely due to the mechanization of war. But then we're starting to get into a history lesson here, which is not what your English essays should be. And then Burling kind of reaches, he's reached his stride here, and he starts to really go for it. He describes the Titanic as being unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Again, couldn't be more wrong. Priestley is deliberately not just picking things that he was slightly wrong about, picking the most profoundly incorrect things he could have believed. Believing the Titanic is unsinkable is, of course, been proved by history to be utterly incorrect, because it sank and many, many died. And so all that is happening in these speeches is that it is serving to really consolidate from the beginning this idea that Burling is a man who likes to talk and talk and talk, but knows nothing. He talks an infinite deal of nothing, as Shakespeare says. And this is what the 1945 audience would have immediately understood about him. The little sort of hidden thing at the end there. Oh, incidentally, there's very few capital letters in this PDF, so I've just added one to Russia there. Priestley, of course, was a socialist. And by having Burling say that everyone will be prosperous except Russia, which will always be behindhand naturally, Priestley is actually, again, reinforcing this ignorance, because in his opinion, Russia was actually one of the most successful by 1945, in that it had fully embraced a socialist ideology. Now, you can of course, disagree with Priestley because of, socialism didn't end that well in Russia. But that's what he's saying. In his opinion, socialism was the way to go, and Russia was the first country to really implement it on a very large scale. And so again, Berling saying that is reinforcing how much Berling himself hates socialism and how he thinks it's backwards and kind of archaic and frankly sort of barbaric. That is what Priestley is getting at. Now, at this point, the women have left, and Berling starts to get the cigars out and to get the port out. Port being a classic after-dinner drink. And as I mentioned, alcohol is a motif, but what it presents in the play is this idea of rejecting or refusing to take responsibility for actions. Of course, alcohol can cloud people's judgment, and it can make them act in ways that they may not normally, but it also takes away their inhibitions, and so maybe makes them more likely to do things that deep down they want to, but try to stop themselves. And that is what happens consistently in Inspector Calls. And this initial part is just a way of reminding the audience that the Berlings certainly engage in the practice of social drinking because they can, because they very much can. They have no obligations, they have no reason not to. It's yet again another sign of how pleased with themselves they are and how they haven't a care in the world, essentially. At this point, Berling goes on a bit of an odd tangent to Gerald. He sort of apologizes for Sheila not being of Gerald's class socially. He says, "You must apologize to your mother," as in Lady Croft, because she may feel that you could have done better. Now, this is, of course, nodding to what we said about the idea that Berling himself is not from the aristocracy. He calls Sir George and Lady Croft's family as landed people. Now, that is the landed gentry, which is the historic landowning classes in this country, which are the real original upper classes, the real elite. Now, Berling, on the other hand, is what you might call new money, i.e. he has made his money himself. And so while being cash rich, he doesn't have a sort of historical family name that he can sit on in order to really prove how wealthy he is, and also to prove how his status, I think, is a good way of describing it. And this is why he talks about his knighthood, because he believes that that's the thing that will make him truly belong in this, totally top social bracket. The top rung nearly of the British social hierarchy. The knighthood will be the thing that people hear first of all. They will not hear Arthur Berling, a man who made his own money and came from humble beginnings. They will hear Sir Arthur Berling, and this is kind of what his life has been leading towards, the thing that will give him the most pride. And it's clearly the thing that bothers him most later about the potential scandal. Eric returns and he starts to describe how his mother and sister are talking about clothing, and he says that they're potty about them. Now, this is a sort of casual, low-level misogyny, compared with what he does later, certainly. But it sums up his character. It sums up Eric as being a man who has a low opinion of women. Now, then his father goes on to completely agree with him. And he in fact one-ups him. He's saying that clothing is a token or a sign of their self-respect. And so therefore Berling himself echoes this message and echoes this misogyny. And then, of course, the next line, "Gerald, that's true." So they're all at it. They are all in this category. And it's just a simple way of reminding the audience that all three of these men have got very preconceived, stereotypical opinions of women and do not see them necessarily as being equals in any way. Berling then embarks on his famous Bees in a Hive speech. You can watch my previous video, which has a much more detailed language analysis of that. But essentially, he initially falsely says, "I don't want to lecture you two young fellows," which he absolutely does, because Berling likes nothing more than to lecture people. He likes to tell people his opinion without hearing any disagreement or any response back. He, in this speech, outlines his total opposition to socialism and his total desire for this kind of overtly selfish worldview, which you could describe as being utterly kind of fundamentally capitalist. He says a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself. There's a lot of first person and possessive pronouns in this speech that really kind of identifies his belief that it is not the job of the rich to share their wealth with anyone. It is not the job of people with means to make the lives of others better. He describes people who disagrees with him as being cranks. Now, this is a pejorative term that means somebody who goes against accepted belief or kind of the commonly held opinions and will not be reasoned with. And so it's almost like he's almost calling them conspiracy theorists, is a good way of describing what they are now. And of course, this is ironic because this is actually what he is, a man who is so entrenched in his own beliefs that he will hear no contradiction to them at all. He then says that we shouldn't live like bees in a hive, and the simile here is used to, again, show his ignorance, because he is using it to kind of indicate that we shouldn't live like these insects who seemingly buzz around and get nothing done, whereas in reality, actually, bees are incredibly efficient creatures. But it also shows his complete lack of respect for the working classes. However, just as he's reaching his crescendo, the climax of his speech, the doorbell rings, and it's the inspector. Now, the doorbell and the telephone and just interruption in general are a constant in this play, and it's usually Arthur Burling who is the one being interrupted. And it shows that it's Priestley's way of showing that the world is tired of people like him, and it's tired of opinions like his. It's certainly his way of showing that he disagrees with it. And because it's the inspector who so frequently interrupts him, that is the thing that he is, and because it's the inspector who interrupts him, and of course the inspector represents socialism, that is the part that he most strongly goes against Burling. Okay, I hope that you found this to be a helpful video. Make sure you stay tuned for the next one, and good luck.